Chapter V. The Dark Ages. Under popes and emperors. It is by the blood of its confessors, and not of its adversaries, that the gospel triumphs. History of the Reformation, I:88. At the time of Christ, and for the next 500 years, righteous Christians had to contend with the unholy powers of the Roman Empire. But finally the reign of the emperors dissolved with the fall of that empire. Then from out of the ashes of the emperors rose the same tyrannical powers from the popes. Rome changed titles, but her despotism was the same. Thus true Christians suffered from one despicable tyrant or another. But, as with all totalitarian governments, the populace suffered the loss of personal freedom. And what is worse, such tyranny always breeds corruption. During the 1500 years of apostasy and dictatorial reigns of emperors and popes, public morality dropped to its lowest ebb. People would say anything, or do anything, for gain. Robbery was so prevalent that it appeared to be one of the major occupations. As apostasy gradually overtook the Church of Christ, so did crime and immorality overtake its members. A man's word became worthless. The laws arranged for solemn oaths at every turn. Men swore on the scriptures or the most sacred relics. Sometimes they were required to take an oath that they would keep the oath they were about to take. Yet perjury was so frequent that trial by combat was sometimes resorted to in hope that God would identify the great liar. The Story of Civilization IV, The Age of Faith, Will Durant, page 829. The Christians who were more obedient to the doctrines and teachings of Christ than to the allegiance of an emperor or pope were often placed in fearful circumstances. Whenever Christians were brought before a magistrate of the Roman Empire, they were often presented with an oath. The Colosseum, the arena of death for many Christian martyrs. Of allegiance to the laws. If they refused, they were usually sentenced to death. Later, at the height of the Pope's power, a similar oath of allegiance was administered, and the direful consequences were just the same. The following stories illustrate the struggle of those faithful saints who had these two despotic powers to contend with. Only a few random examples will have to suffice, for thousands upon thousands died in valor during those centuries of the Dark Ages. Justin, the famous philosopher, was born in the year 103. He was given the best education that money could afford and went to Egypt to further his studies. When he was 30 years of age, he became a convert to Christianity and did much writing and speaking, principally to the Jews to convince them of the truths of Christianity. He later took up residence in Rome, where he became a teacher and continued his writings, which gained him great renown as a Christian philosopher. One example of his talents and gifts was exhibited during the persecutions by the Romans. He wrote an apology for the Christians, addressing it to the Emperor Antoninus, the Senate, and to the people of Rome. This apology displayed such learning and genius that the emperor published an edict in favor of the Christians. Later Justin entered a debate with Crescens, a cynic philosopher. Justin defeated the heathen's arguments, but in revenge he was able to have Justin brought to a trial. Crescens stood as the accuser and Justin, with 6 others, was demanded to make a denial of their faith and sacrifice to the Roman gods. They refused to do either. They were then condemned and scourged with whips. One of the Christians, by the name of Concordus, was dragged before the image of Jupiter and demanded to worship it. But he spit in its face, for which he was beheaded with a sword. The rest, with Justin, then suffered the same fate. Perpetua. Persecutions extended throughout all the Roman provinces, which also included northern Africa, at about 200 AD. One of those captured was Perpetua, a young married lady of about 26 years of age. Her father, who dearly loved her, went to the prison and begged her to renounce Christianity. When brought to trial, she was taken before the proconsul, Minucius, who demanded that she make a sacrifice to the idols. She refused, for which she was put into prison and her little baby was taken away from her. Perpetua's father came again and begged her to renounce Christianity, so she could be liberated from the dungeon. She remained firm to her faith by refusing her father's wish, saying God's will must be done. With a broken heart he left her in the darkness of the dungeon. After a few more days of imprisonment, the Christians were summoned to appear before the judge. One by one they were exhorted to forsake their religion and deny the Lord, but they one and all remained firm. When it came to Perpetua's turn, suddenly her father appeared, carrying her child in his arms. He came near to the young mother, and pointing to the helpless little one, dependent on her for subsistence, entreated her to have compassion on her babe. Even the judge seemed to be moved, and added his persuasions to those of her father. "Spare the grey hairs of your father," he said, "spare your child. Offer sacrifice for the welfare of the emperor." But Perpetua answered, "I will not sacrifice." Still her father continued his entreaties, until the judge, tired of his frequent interruptions, ordered him to be removed by the guards. He then passed sentence on the Christians. It was that they should be killed by wild beasts as a spectacle for the people on the next holiday. Christian Martyrs, John Fox, page 67. While she was in prison awaiting her punishment, her father returned to sit silently in grief. All this was bitterly hard for Perpetua to bear, but God did not leave his servants comfortless. Bright visions of heavenly glory came to many of them, and to Perpetua among the rest. Finally those days of imprisonment were ended and the Christians were brought to the arena. Perpetua and others came singing. The men were sentenced to be torn to pieces by leopards and bears. Perpetua and a young woman named Felicitas were hung up in nets, at first naked, where they were soon placed before a wild bull. The bull, goaded into mad fury, was let loose upon them, and Felicitas fell wounded while Perpetua was tossed aside. She then arose and rushed to the side of the dying Felicitas. The bull made no further attacks, but the fierce multitude clamored for them to receive their death sentence. Having kissed each other, they were attacked by gladiators who killed them with the sword. Julian. During the reign of Decius, a dreadful persecution began in 249 AD. His jealousy towards the Christians became furious as he watched their numbers continue to increase, while the temples of the heathen were gradually being forsaken. In his anger he became determined to destroy the Christians. In Cilicia a Christian man by the name of Julian was arrested and tortured. He would not sacrifice to the Roman gods, nor would he deny his own religion. He was frequently tortured, but he remained firm. He was then made to travel for 12 months, from town to town, being exposed to the insults and torments of Roman citizens. Then when all endeavors to make him recant his religion were found ineffectual, he was brought before a judge, stripped, and whipped in a dreadful manner. Then he was put into a leather bag, together with a number of serpents and scorpions, and in that condition he was thrown into the sea. Laurentius. The Roman Emperor Valerian came to the throne in 257 AD, and for nearly 4 years brought about a vicious attack against Christians. National laws were made which brought them under condemnation. During this time martyrs were numerous. The Christians were tortured with many and vicious new kinds of torments. Laurentius was a deacon when Sextus, a bishop, was led out to be executed. As they parted from each other for the last time, the bishop prophesied that his young friend, too, would someday have to follow him to martyrdom. Macrianus, the governor of Rome, under the Emperor Valerian, had heard a rumor that the Christians were rich, causing him considerable yearning to have the wealth for himself. He sent soldiers to arrest Laurentius, or Lawrence, as he was usually called. He was dragged up to the governor, who said that he had heard of the great treasures of the church, to which Lawrence agreed that the church did indeed have treasures. Then bring those treasures forth, for do not your sacred books tell you to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's? The emperor has need of those riches for the defense of the empire, therefore you must render them up. After reflecting deeply for a few moments, Lawrence replied, "In 3 days I will bring before you the greatest treasures of the church." Lawrence was set free, after which on the appointed day he appeared before the governor. "Are the treasures collected?" was the first question of Macrianus. "They are, my lord," replied Lawrence. "Will you enter and view them?" With these words he opened a door and displayed to the astounded gaze of the governor the poor pensioners of the church, a chosen number, a row of the lame, a row of the blind, orphans and widows, the helpless and the weak. Astonished by the sight, the governor turned fiercely upon Lawrence, saying, "What mean you by this mockery? Where are the treasures of gold and silver you promised to deliver up?" "These that you see before you," replied the undaunted Lawrence, "are the true treasures of the church. In the widows and orphans you behold her gold and her silver, her pearls and precious stones. These are her real riches. Make use of them by asking for their prayers, they will prove your best weapons against your foes." Christian Martyrs, Fox, page 86. The governor was enraged and greatly disappointed at not getting gold and silver. He commanded his guards to seize Lawrence and take him to a dungeon. A fire was built on the floor of the dungeon, upon which was placed a huge gridiron. Lawrence was then stripped of his clothing and thrown upon it. The cruel tyrant, who condemned him, was there to witness the sight. But the martyr had the spirit to offer a prayer, and with his dying breath he prayed for the Christian church, and that someday Rome would be converted to God. Thus, in terrible agony and suffering, he finally gave up the ghost. But a Roman soldier named Romanus, who witnessed the spectacle of such suffering and the bravery of Lawrence, was so much affected by that courage and faith that he was converted to Christianity. When it was discovered, he too had to pay the price by being severely scourged and then beheaded. The Christian Legion. In 284 Diocletian became the emperor. Under his jurisdiction there was a legion of soldiers consisting of about 6,000 men who were nearly all Christians. It was called the Theban Legion, and had just been ordered by the Emperor Maximian to march to Gaul, now France, to assist in fighting against the rebels of Azuetania. Passing the Alps, they finally were joined by the emperor. But, just before engaging with the enemy, Maximian ordered a general sacrifice to the gods of the empire, in which the whole army was to participate. He commanded that the men should also take oaths of allegiance, and swear to assist him in driving Christianity out of Gaul. This order caused great concern to the soldiers. After some consideration they refused to either sacrifice or take the oath. This enraged Maximian, and he ordered every 10th man to be cut down with the sword. This cruel and inhuman order was carried out, and 600 men fell by the sword for refusing to take that oath. Those who remained were still firm to their convictions. Again the order to cut down every 10th man was given, and carried out. But the second slaughter made no more impression of renunciation than the first. By the advice of the officers, a letter was drawn up to remonstrate, indicating that they realized their pay was obtained from the emperor, however, their lives were given them by their God. They wrote, "Our arms are devoted to the emperor's use, and shall be directed against his enemies, but we cannot stain our hands with Christian blood, and how, indeed, could you, O emperor, be sure of our fidelity, should we violate our obligation to our God, in whose service we solemnly engaged before we entered the army? You command us to search out and to destroy the Christians. It is not necessary to look any further than ourselves. We ourselves are Christians, and we glory in the name. We saw our companions fall without the least complaint, and thought them happy in dying for the sake of Christ. But nothing shall make us lift up our hands against our sovereign. We would rather die wrongfully, and by that means preserve our innocence, than live under a load of guilt. Whatever you command, we are ready to suffer. We confess ourselves to be Christians, and therefore cannot persecute our brothers nor sacrifice to idols." Christian Martyrs, page 99. This noble reply should have moved the mercy of the emperor into pardoning them, but it had an opposite effect upon him. He was enraged at their refusing to obey his orders. He commanded all of his officers to fall upon the whole Theban legion, and put them to death. His orders were carried out, thus all 6,000 Christian soldiers were put to death for their refusal to subscribe to the emperor's oath of allegiance. Alban. The first British martyr was said to have been Alban. He had been brought up believing in the ancient gods of Rome. But being a kindly man, he once sheltered a Christian named Amphibolus, who was being pursued because of his religion. After the two had conversed about the Christian religion, Alban was greatly impressed by his guest and became converted. But the enemies of Amphibolus had discovered his hiding place and came to the house of Alban to capture him. But Alban now became more than a friendly host. He decided to change clothes with Amphibolus, so that when the soldiers came, he gave himself up as the prisoner they were seeking. Alban was taken before the governor, but the fraud was discovered. Alban was then demanded to sacrifice to Jupiter, but Alban declared, "I am a Christian." The governor ordered him to be dragged to the foot of the statue and scourged so that he would worship the idol. But the punishment bore no fruits as Alban continued courageous with his new-found faith. They continued to beat and torture him, but he endured with great courage. Finally the governor ordered his head to be taken off with the sword. This martyrdom took place in England, then a Roman province, in a town called Verulam. It is now named St. Albans, in Hertfordshire. Theodotus. The governor of Dalmatia, about 300 AD, resided on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea. He received with great pleasure an order to persecute the Christians. The populace were urged on by the governor to persecute them, so everyone seized and imprisoned every Christian they could find. Thus by their efforts to capture Christians, they were allowed to take their goods and possessions, including their homes. Many Christians fled into the woods where some starved to death. During this dreadful time, Theodotus, a Christian innkeeper, did all he could to comfort, feed, and to hide other Christians. He buried the bodies of several Christians, which was also forbidden. But not all Christians could brave the sufferings and afflictions that were thrown upon them. One of them, named Polychronicus, was seized and soon began to renounce his faith. Then he informed on other Christians, Theodotus being one. So Theodotus was seized and brought before the governor, where he looked upon the numerous instruments of torture without any fear. The governor informed him that it was still in his power to save him if he would sacrifice to the gods of the empire. Then he was also promised to become one of the chief men of the city. Theodotus displayed great courage and eloquence in his answer, which was a refusal to renounce his faith, or to pay homage to the strange gods of the empire. Bystanders and the priests of the empire were enraged and demanded that he be punished according to the law. He was then scourged and put on the rack, after which his flesh was seared with burning torches. He was then taken back to prison, and on the way he spoke to the crowd, saying, "It is but just that a Christian should suffer for him who suffered for us all." 5 days later he was taken from prison for more torturing, after which he was beheaded. Transposition of empires. In the 5th century, the great Roman Empire was taken into captivity and consummated its historic fall. Centuries of its barbarity and cruelty finally came to an end. Shortly after this, the Christian Church began to gain in numbers, power and wealth. But ironically sad, the Church began to employ the same barbarity, cruelty and bloody persecutions that she herself had once suffered. From persecuted to persecutor, the Christian religion had fallen back into the inducements of the heathen. Historians noticed that when the throne of Caesar was overturned, how the chair of Peter stood erect. The leadership of the Church soon threw off the rags of persecution, only to be vested with the styles and customs of Babylon. The poor contemptible Christian had now become honored in the palaces of the rich. The Church, once hidden, driven and mobbed, had now become a major power over the minds and pockets of nations. And he who once sat as the great high priest for Christ, now became the banker, investor, and the temporal manager of business enterprises throughout the world. The spread of the Christian religion during the first 3 centuries was rapid and extensive. Its power of conversion was attributed to the zeal of its ministers and the heroic examples of its leaders. One of the main privations of the Church came from these horrid persecutions, causing the loss of its most stalwart men. But the most terrible blow against the Church was the influence of the half-converted wealthy intellectuals. Dignities and wealth now flowed in upon its ministers and disciples, and according to the uniform testimony of all the early historians, the faith which had maintained its purity and rigor in the humble sanctuaries and lowly position of the first age, and amid the fires of its pagan persecutors, became. These worldly-minded men gave the Church temporal power by the sacrifice of spiritual gifts. As doctrines and principles of the gospel were changed, the Church purchased new favors and more powerful positions in the world. It was because of these changes in the Church that the humble, spiritual men of the Church began to rebel. Stephen and Lazoir. During the 9th century, 2 young men, Stephen and Lazoir, were very distinguished because of their pious sincerity and acts of charity to others. They became adept at teaching the Scriptures and promoting faith in Christ. At every opportunity they would be teaching and instructing others, which soon brought them under the suspicion of the Catholic Church. Many came to hear them expound the gospel. However, they were to be betrayed by one who reigned as a disciple, named Ariphist. Although this fellow seemed to always be craving to be instructed in the things of God, he seemed to listen not only with the ear, but with the heart also. So these 2 instructors explained how foolish it was to pray to statues, and how impossible it was for the sacrament to become. The council tried to dissuade them for their beliefs. A written oath was presented, but the 2 stood boldly to the truth which they had long held. The arguments and threats of the council were alike powerless to change their belief, or to shake their resolution. Then the council threatened their lives with burning at the stake, but they would not yield. So the sentence of death was passed upon them. They were first stripped of their clerical vestments, then buffeted like their master, then smitten with rods, the queen, who was present, setting the example in these acts of violence by striking one of them, and putting out his eye. Finally, they were led outside the city, where a great fire had been kindled to consume them. Hist. Of Protestantism I:50. There were another 10 disciples, some say 12, who were also willing to share the stake with them. Together this little band of Christians, bound together, refused to yield their faith. They too entered the flames to be set free from the toils of mortal life. They perished in the year 1022. Vitterius. John Vitterius was a Franciscan monk in Tournai. He witnessed many of the corruptions which had crept into the Church, and sought to warn the people of their dangers. On one occasion he wrote, It is better to cut a child's throat than to place him in a religious order that is not reformed. He declared that the convents had been converted to brothels, and the monasteries had been filled with mistresses. Perceiving the moral and spiritual dangers of such corruption in the orders of the Church, he said that many of the priests were sensual seducers. Vitterius saw so many dangers from men robed in the priestly attire, that he wrote, "If thy curate or any other priest detains a woman in his house, you should go and drag the woman by force out of the house." To these moral lepers he declared, "There are some who repeat certain prayers to the Virgin Mary, that they may see her at the hour of death. But thou shalt see the devil, and not the Virgin." In 1498 he was brought up before the council and told that he should recant or else suffer the consequences. The monk gave way and conceded to the council. Vitterius, like many others had and would do, gave a verbal or written statement of recantation of what he knew or believed to be true. Through the threat of prison or death many men give way to their faith and renounce the truth. The Inquisition. During these dark ages, when the torch of persecution was lit, it was by the Church rather than against it. She could not tolerate any belief other than her own, so the Crusades and the Inquisition were created as a muscle of temporal terror to conform the mind and consciences of men. The Crusaders were organized by the promises of the Church that their sins would be washed away when they shed the blood of Church foes. Some of these forces numbered as many as 500,000 men who swept through cities, killing, robbing, and raping their victims, all in the name of a holy war. They would have been more appropriately named the Wicked Wars, because of the crimes of murder and plunder that were created by them. Nearly 500,000 men were armed with every conceivable weapon, and their tempests of war thundered all over Europe. In the spring of 1209 AD these fanatics began to march against the rich territories of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. This overwhelming host precipitated itself upon the estates of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. Seeing the storm approach, he was seized with dread, wrote submissive letters to Rome, and offered to accept whatever terms the papal legate might please to dictate. As the price of his reconciliation, he had to deliver up to the Pope 7 of his strongest towns, to appear at the door of the church, where the dead body of the legate Castelnau, who had been murdered in his dominions, lay, and to be there beaten with rods. Next, a rope was put about his neck, and he was dragged by the legate to the tomb of the friar, in the presence of several bishops, and an immense multitude of spectators. After all this, he was obliged to take the cross, and join with those who were seizing and plundering his cities, massacring his subjects, and carrying fire and sword throughout his territories. Stung by these humiliations and calamities, he again changed sides. But his resolution to brave the papal wrath came too late. He was again smitten with interdict, his possessions were given to Simon de Montfort, and in the end he saw himself reft of all. Hist. Of Protestantism, Vol. 141. Thus by the sword and blood the Church gained victories over men and their possessions. But such extreme fanaticism created only more revolt and stronger opposition. It gave birth to Protestantism.